Next on Currents News, on September 11th, a Brooklyn scholar's newest project explores how Catholic families were forever changed by the evil unleashed that day. We'll hear from her. The anniversary of the deadliest terror attack ever on U.S. soil, the president leads America in remembering. As the storm swirls, more than 1 million people are being ordered to move out of the path of Hurricane Florence. Plus, the Pope will meet U.S. bishops on Thursday. They want the Holy Father to investigate the McCarrick case. The news starts right now. Mourners gathered under misty skies this morning at the 9/11 memorial. Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Faublas. With the memories of the day still vivid in the minds of so many, a Brooklyn scholar has launched a new project about September 11th and the impact that evil day has had on Catholic families in the tri-state area. In Currents News, Tim Harfman is here now with more. Tim.
Liz, Dr. Julie Byrne wasn't in New York 17 years ago today, but she says the stories she's heard, many of them from Catholics, have inspired her and even received a national grant to write her latest book. The solemn scene outside Catholic churches still affects Dr. Julie Byrne today.
The impression of bells tolling for weeks and months on Long Island after 9/11 really stayed with me from the memories of my friends and colleagues.
So much so that Dr. Byrne, an author and chair of Catholic Studies at Hofstra University, is writing a book.
What has it meant for these Catholics to lose those people who were possibly the first generation white-collar professionals of their families?
Dr. Byrne is in the early stages of the project, and her book is one of 22 public undertakings to recently receive a federal grant to continue her research and writing.
To focus on those who perished and the Catholic families that they left behind can tell us something about the trajectory of Catholic generations in the United States that I'm very interested to explore.
Another generation she's interested in, millennials, many of whom do not have vivid memories of that day.
These young people, even those who were very small when 9/11 happened, still have the body memory in their families. There's resonances. I don't know much about it now, but I'd like to figure out how it's still affecting people, even if they weren't alive for it.
Nearly 3,000 innocent people died on September 11th, 2001, including over 340 New York City firefighters and 70 police officers. Countless more have been affected by post-9/11 illnesses. Dr. Byrne was teaching in Texas when the U.S. fell under attack. She was 1,500 miles from loved ones in New York.
I was concerned for everybody. I was figuring out what happened, why it happened, and calling family like everyone else was.
And 17 years later, she wants to share the stories of those who were on the ground during that time, to make sure that others never forget.
You're going to see those whose faith was strengthened by it, and you're going to see those whose faith was really challenged by it as well.
And Dr. Byrne plans to have the book published in 3 years, coinciding with the 20th anniversary of the attacks, Liz.
Tim, now obviously the book focuses on Catholics, but does it also explore how worshipers of other religions are affected by 9/11?
Dr. Byrne says obviously so many people of every background were affected, so she's not pretending that 9/11 was only about Catholics, but because of the Catholic funerals and mourning in the aftermath, she's solely focusing on Catholicism.
All right, Tim, thank you so much for that clarification. Catholics gathered in the Brooklyn Diocese for a solemn march and mass at the Co-Cathedral of St. Joseph to remember those who perished that day. New York's bravest led the procession carrying 23 flags, each one honoring a member of Brooklyn's Battalion 57 killed at the World Trade Center. The march symbolizes bringing the brothers back home. One of the fallen was firefighter Lee Fei Ling. His mother, Joan Bischoff, remembers her son.
He was in Brooklyn, and little did I know, he was one of the first to be called to the Trade Center. So I was also with his wife, Danielle. She was 9 months pregnant with their second child. She was born a month after he passed.
The rector of the Co-Cathedral, Monsignor Kieran Harrington, celebrated the memorial mass. Across America, family members and loved ones mark the 17th anniversary of the awful day when airplanes became weapons and killed so many. At Ground Zero, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania, commemoration ceremonies honor the victims. Natasha Chen reports.
My Uncle Martin Lizzle, we love you, we miss you.
In New York, at the Pentagon,
Staff Sergeant Madeline A. White.
and in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Flight Attendant C.C. Ross Lyles.
People read the names of nearly 3,000 loved ones who were killed 17 years ago on September 11th. President Trump honored the passengers and crew of United 93.
We remember the moment when America fought back.
The 40 people on that flight learned other planes had crashed into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and voted to fight the hijackers. They took control of the plane and forced it down into a Pennsylvania field. Investigators later learned the hijackers intended to target the U.S. Capitol or the White House.
America will never forget.
The phrase never forget becomes even more important on this anniversary, considering today's teenagers were born after 9/11. Vice President Mike Pence underscored that message at the Pentagon, saying these ceremonies are meant to honor the victims, but also to ensure each succeeding generation knows what happened and why.
We must learn the lessons of 9/11 and remain ever vigilant in the defense of our nation and our people.
Former Pennsylvania Governor Mark Schweiker said we must tell their story.
When you do, tell everyone it was here that freedom took its dramatic stand.
In Washington, Natasha Chen, Currents News.
The Vatican is preparing so-called clarifications about accusations Pope Francis covered up the sexual misconduct of ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. Francis has refused to respond to the charges leveled by Archbishop Carlos Vigano that the pontiff knew about McCarrick's wrongdoings. No word on when these clarifications might be released. There's also news the Pope will meet with an American delegation on Thursday after the U.S. Bishops' Conference asked the Holy Father to launch an investigation into how the ex-cardinal rose to power. So joining us now is the national correspondent for the Tablet and Crux, Christopher White, to help us unpack these details. Christopher, what will happen on Thursday at the Vatican?
Well, lots to unpack, Liz. On Thursday at noon Rome time, Pope Francis will meet with a delegation of U.S. bishops. That delegation will be headed by Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, who is the president of the Bishops' Conference. He'll be joined by Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles, who's the vice chairman, Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who heads the protection for minors at the Vatican and is the Archbishop of Boston, and then Monsignor Brian Bransfield, who is the Secretary General of the USCCB. There, they will press Pope Francis to launch an official investigation into how former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick rose through the ranks of power for so long, having covered up decades of his own abuse. And this is their effort to get the Pope to launch a Vatican investigation into this.
Christopher, I want to talk about these clarifications in response to the Vigano accusations that the Pope mishandled the McCarrick case. What's going to be clarified?
Well, Liz, if you remember, Archbishop Vigano said that Pope Francis had removed sanctions placed on him by Pope Benedict XVI. Now, over the past few weeks since this letter first came out, there's been a lot of questions as to whether those sanctions really existed at all. So I think a lot of people are expecting these clarifications from the Vatican to actually give a definitive word. Were there ever official sanctions, or was the former cardinal just told to keep a low profile? So that's what we're trying to get at the bottom of here, and I think that's what we're going to be looking for when this report from the Vatican is released.
And you know, with all of this news breaking, we hear a lot about canon law in these situations. What is meant by the phrase, and what is the distinction? Why is it different from civil law?
So canon law is the law in which sort of allows the church to govern itself. So when we think of civil law, of course, we often think about, our rules and regulations for, our society. Well, that's the same thing inside the church. But canon law is specifically looking at sort of how bishops and priests are to behave and the proper procedures there. So things that wouldn't actually be addressed by, say, civil law, but are important to the life of the church and are needed. And in fact, if you think about it, canon law has really governed the church since its beginning, 2,000 years ago. And of course, over the years, it's been codified in a more formal way to address the actual internal life of the church.
Now, the distinction obviously is very important, so thank you for that, Christopher. But doesn't the church follow civil law on issues of sexual abuse? Isn't that the legal requirement?
Yes, of course, Liz. In fact, when you hear church officials talk about issues of sexual abuse, the very first thing out of their mouth, or most of the time that it should be, is this has to be reported to the civil authorities. So, canon law does not exist to usurp civil authority. It works alongside of it. So, if a priest is found guilty of abuse, civil law will say there has to be criminal punishment. He may go to jail or that sort of thing. Canon law deals with, does this priest, get removed from ministry? What sort of authority does the bishop have there? Those sort of questions that are particular to the internal life of the church.
Really quickly, Christopher, what are some of the biggest challenges with canon law with regard to cases like this?
Well, Liz, right now the biggest challenge is there is no mechanism in canon law to hold bishops accountable for covering up sex abuse. So that is what we're looking for, possible correction in the months to come.
All right, Christopher, thank you so much. There was a lot to deal with there, so I appreciate the reporting as always. Well, now for the latest on Hurricane Florence. With winds hitting 140 miles an hour, the storm is making its way to the U.S. with the middle of the East Coast the most likely target. More than 1 million people are being ordered to get out of the way. Omar Jimenez reports the latest.
Hurricane Florence is the strongest storm to target the Carolinas in this part of our country in decades. This storm is not a glancing blow. This storm is going to be a direct hit.
Officials not mincing words Tuesday as they implore those living in the path of Florence to get prepared and get out.
I ordered the evacuation, the mandatory evacuation, because we're not going to gamble with a single South Carolina life.
More than 1 million people in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia were under mandatory evacuations Tuesday, including the entire 187-mile stretch of coastline in South Carolina.
We've reversed the lanes. 4 of the main highways coming from the coast will all be going in just one direction, away from the coast.
Even for those not directly along the coastline, heavy rain, flooding, and landslides are still serious concerns as the storm moves inland. Residents there are stocking up on things like generators, food, and water as they prepare to hunker down.
We will experience power outages. We will have infrastructure damage. There will be homes damaged. There will be debris on the roads. This will be a storm that creates and causes massive damage to our country.
In Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina, Omar Jimenez, Currents News.
Well, there's a lot more news headed your way. I'll have the story of an investigation into a Catholic orphanage decades after complaints of physical abuse. Danger at the border when bullets are fired. The gunplay is to send a message to U.S. agents. And the remarkable young man whose rendition of the national anthem wowed the crowd at Wrigley Field. And do you have a story idea, something happening in your parish we should know about? We want to hear from you. Keep this email handy, newstips@desalesmedia.org. Email us. We'll be right back. The state of Vermont is forming a special task force to investigate claims of physical abuse at a Catholic orphanage many decades ago. A former resident speaks out on behalf of young children believed to have suffered unspeakable horrors.
It has come out time and time again, yet it was not believed.
Louise Pichet spoke out as Vermont officials announced a joint task force investigating alleged abuse and possibly 3 murders at the now closed St. Joseph's Catholic Orphanage in Burlington.
It's the telling to young children that they will burn in hell if they tell their parents, if they tell anyone.
She's talking about the reports of alleged abuse by nuns and priests at the orphanage in the 1950s and 60s. Former Burlington Free Press reporter Sam Hemingway wrote about some of the cases that were settled in the 90s.
The world has changed a great deal since the mid-90s, and If these folks, these former residents of the orphanage, happen to have brought this whole issue and all of these horrors out in the mid-2000s, after, you know, so much pre-sex abuse had started to be exposed and the world was starting to see, oh my gosh, this stuff happened. I think there might have been a different fate in the courts.
Vermont Attorney General T.J. Donovan says his office will join with the state police, Burlington Police Department, and the Chittenden County State's Attorney's Office to investigate what happened at the orphanage and bring justice to victims, even if it's outside of the courtroom.
There's a lot of pain that needs to be reconciled and healed, and this is not going to be easy.
Officials say they'll work as long as it takes. Pichet says she doesn't want to blame the nuns. She just wants to make sure what happened to her and others at the orphanage never happens again.
It's important not to believe that this is somehow anti-Catholic or anti-church or anti-faith, because there's great goodness there as well. That's why it's important to find out what happened here.
The Diocese of Burlington says it will fully cooperate with investigators. Survivors of clerical sex abuse in Kentucky are calling on their Attorney General to investigate the church. Spurred on by the Pennsylvania grand jury report, they've accused the church of not doing all it can to find and root out abusive priests.
Who covered it up? When did they cover it up? Why did they cover up? All of that.
It's still going on, but to what extent, we don't know.
The Attorney General Andy Beshear announced this afternoon that he is seeking legislative authority to form a statewide grand jury that would investigate the Catholic Diocese of Kentucky. Louisville Archbishop Joseph Kurtz said he'll issue a report next month about the sex abuse scandal and how it's been handled. 2 men are in custody tonight, suspected of shooting at a U.S. Border Patrol agent in California. Dan Plant reports.
If there ever was a doubt how dangerous this job can be, well, this is a brutal reminder.
Cartels run everything over there, so anytime there's a bump in their business, of course they want to send a message.
Over the weekend, that message came in the form of gunshots from the Mexican side of the border. 2 shots, 2 holes in the truck, and the agent escapes physically unharmed.
Was this person lucky?
I'd consider it one of those things where, yeah, they were fortunate that the person missed, because you're kind of a sitting duck, and there's nothing that we can really do about it. It's just the nature of our business.
Even though assaults on the agents have increased along the border, this is the first time in a long time they've had to dodge bullets.
As far as the shootings from the south side, that hasn't happened since the last one that I can remember in this area anyway, is the one where the agent was actually injured and had to get medical attention. Yeah.
And how long ago was that? Was that like?
That was probably about 15 years ago.
15 years?
Yeah.
This is a job full of long hours and long and lonely roads where anything can happen at any time. A job where the agents are accustomed to being targets, but carry on anyway.
So they're like trying to intimidate you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been my entire career. There's been one way or another. I think at one point there was about $1 million bounty on the heads of Border Patrol agents, but these are just tactics that they use to dissuade us from doing the job that we've sworn to do.
When the bullets started flying, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the border agent couldn't possibly have been in a worse position. A situation similar to this, where there's 2 sets of fences, one on the Mexico side, one on the American side. And when the bullets started flying, that agent was stuck in between. And now that there's more pressure on the border, there is also more pressure on the cartels to keep their criminal operations going. In the haze of political rhetoric, sometimes we forget Mexican cartels are now the main suppliers of heroin across the world.
80% of those opioids are coming from cartels in Mexico, and it doesn't stop at the border, that it ends up in Wisconsin, that it ends up in Detroit, that it ends up in Santa Maria.
So despite the emotional banter we hear so much these days, here on the border, there are very bad people doing very bad things. Those bullets are a reminder this is more than a game to be used as a political wedge.
That was Dan Plant reporting from California. Still to come on Currents News, the Pope preached about human weakness. His words are coming up. A lifelong dream comes true and thousands of fans enjoy that moment. And to top it all off, the Special Olympics gets a nice donation. The story is ahead. We'll be right back. Pope Francis is explaining the difference between a weak man and the hypocrite. The Holy Father says the weak man is humble and recognizes his sins, while the hypocrite does not want to change. The pontiff was clear about the distinction during his homily.
Se tu accetti di essere peccatore e debole, lui ti perdona. Perché parte della novità del Vangelo è confessare che Gesù Cristo è venuto per il perdono dei peccati. Ma se tu ti dici essere cristiano e convivi con queste novità mondane, no, questa è ipocrisia.
Pope Francis recalled that hypocrisy is not new, for St. Paul had rebuked it in the early days of the church. It was special last night for a Cubs fan visiting Wrigley Field for the game. Patrick Elwood tells us about the young man who was granted a wish after raising thousands for the Special Olympics.
Stefan Excitus has Down syndrome, and tonight his dream came true. Singing the national anthem at Wrigley Field.
It's really awesome. I'm so excited. I have practiced so many times when I had some hot tea.
But let's take a Stars and Stripes step back. Several weeks ago, his buddies since kindergarten, Tom on the left and John on the right, came up with an idea.
Damn it, stupid kids.
Of putting together a video and posting it on social media.
He's been just like any other friend that Johnny and I had our whole lives. He's been an inspiration in our lives, and we love the kids.
They started a GoFundMe page, sent the whole concept to the Cubs with the challenge that if they raise $5,000, could he be invited to sing the anthem, all in the name of Special Olympics. His event is tennis. Well, $5,000 and a whole lot more. They're up to $18,000. And get this, the Cubs are going to match it. Stefan's friends and family are here tonight, too. You see the sea of red in the upper deck? That's them. For Stefan's parents, this is as good as it gets kind of moment. How many guys got family and friends are with you tonight?
Over 100. If you look up there, all the red shirts, that's all our guys up there. There they go, they're waving.
Nailed it.
It was the best moment I could ever imagine. It felt so good.
Nice job. Stefan also got to visit the Cubs locker room and meet some players before his performance. That is Currents News. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Liz Faublas. Set your DVR to record this program so that you never miss it, because we are putting your faith in the news. Hope to see you again next time.